Just want to share some things I've been learning, starting with a few months ago when I logged into a Zoom meeting for Freedom Church of the Poor. Those of us who arrived early had begun chatting informally, waiting for other people to join. And during this time of conversation, one of the women on the call started to share something I hadn't expected. She spoke about her recent financial struggles, how her income had been reduced, her bills were overdue, and she was worried about how she would make ends meet in the coming weeks. Her openness caught me off guard. In that moment, I realized how rare it is in my own experience to hear someone in a faith setting speak so honestly about money and hardship. It didn't align with my prior religious experiences. The churches I grew up in and the Christian communities I'd been most familiar with rarely created spaces where such vulnerability about financial struggle was welcome. There was an unspoken rule that your financial state was a private matter, and if you were struggling, you just don't talk about it. Throughout my youth, I attended a range of fundamentalist and conservative churches, and these congregations differed in many ways, but they shared a common discomfort around poverty. A few of the congregations were willing to help what they called the deserving poor, and they were defined as those who had fallen on hard times and it wasn't their fault. But there were others who firmly believed that poverty was a result of personal failure, moral weakness, or a lack of discipline. And across this theological spectrum, what remained constant was the silence. Poverty wasn't something to be named publicly, let alone discussed as a systemic issue. Those experiencing it were expected to keep quiet or risk being judged. Looking back, I can see that those attitudes that I experienced were rooted in flawed and deeply embedded Christian nationalist theology, one that equated material prosperity with divine blessings and financial struggle with moral failure. Within that framework, poverty wasn't seen as a social condition or a collective responsibility, but as evidence of individual sin or laziness. And this belief made it nearly impossible for someone living in poverty to be honest about their needs without fear of condemnation. When people did ask the church for help, they were often interrogated to determine whether they were truly deserving. One church I attended during my teenage years was very active in community outreach. Members stacked firewood for widows, repaired homes, drove neighbors to appointments or Sunday services. Those acts of service were freely offered. But when the need was financial, rent or bills or groceries, the tone shifted. Elderly or disabled individuals might receive help without question, but anyone else faced scrutiny. Were they working hard enough? Had they made poor choices? The underlying message was clear. Physical labor on behalf of others was virtuous, but direct financial support might enable them to be irresponsible. So, given this background, what happened at Freedom Church surprised me deeply. I already knew that Freedom Church of the Poor was committed to addressing poverty, but I had expected something closer to the traditional charity model, where the people who have give to those who have not. Instead, I encountered something more radical, a community in which people, including leaders, spoke openly about their struggles and material needs without shame. Their honesty disrupted the ingrained expectation that faith communities must always present themselves as successful, stable, and blessed. That simple act of sharing promoted me to reflect on my own assumptions about class and ministry. I began asking new questions. Why do so few people entering ministry talk openly about their own financial realities? What does it mean to serve as a minister from within poverty? Or conversely, from a position of comfort, when the people we serve might live entirely different circumstances? How can ministers bridge the class divide that too often shapes relationships within the church? And these questions have driven me to think, and I found very little that addresses them. But reflecting on the early Christian communities helps to have context. The first followers of Jesus were, by most accounts, ordinary working people, Jesus himself is described as a man without a permanent home. Several of his disciples were fishermen, hard-working tradesmen, not the elite. Yet the Gospels also mention Jesus' followers who had access to wealth, such as Joseph of Arimathea, who offered his own tomb for Jesus' burial, and Mary, who anointed him with expensive oil. Jesus often warned against greed and attachment to wealth, urging his followers to sell all you have and give to the poor. But even so, some of his followers clearly retained wealth and found meaning in his message. This raises questions. How did the wealthy followers understand Jesus, the poor rabbi who often spoke of humility and sacrifice? What did he offer them that transcended class boundaries? Perhaps it was not about material redistribution alone, but about reorienting one's heart and priorities. Translating that into modern terms, what does Jesus offer to those of us who live in comfort compared to those who struggle to survive? How can ministers today communicate that same call to justice, humility, and solidarity across social and economic divides? I've also started to become aware of how my own experiences shape the way I engage with these questions. Having lived through economic hardship myself, I sometimes find it difficult to set aside resentment or judgment towards those who seem unaware of their privilege. Wealth can easily be mistaken for arrogance, just as ignorance can be read as malice. Likewise, I sometimes feel the temptation to hide my own socioeconomic background in order to avoid judgment or pity. These inner tensions can become barriers to authentic ministry. To confront them, I believe we must learn to speak about class and poverty as spiritual realities as much as economic ones. Conversations about poverty cannot remain confined to charity drives or mission budgets. They must include honest acknowledgement of our own experiences, assumptions, and biases. Freedom Church of the Poor models this courage, the courage to tell the truth about one's circumstances without fear of stigma. So the question remains, how do we begin to talk about these things in our own congregations? How do we foster communities where the poor do not need to hide, where ministers can speak honestly about their own struggles, where class differences become a point of shared understanding rather than silent division? As we move through Advent, I hear this not only as a question about ministry, but a question about love. Advent love is not sentimental or distant. It is patient, attentive, and willing to dwell in uncomfortable truth. It looks like staying present with one another's need rather than explaining it away or measuring who deserves care. This is the love we wait for in Advent, the love of God who lifts those bent low and refuses to look away.